Hello, welcome everyone. We'll let folks trickle in, but I wanted to go ahead and get us started. Welcome to the March Practice Forum monthly call. I am the Annie staff member who helps support the Practice Forum, and we also have our co-chairs, Liz Joseph and Dr. Kylie Petersmith on the call with us. And we have a guest presenter for the call today, and we're really thrilled to have Kelsey Carrier here. And I'm going to just do a quick bio introduction to her, and then I will turn it over to her. But real quick before I do that, we are offering CEs, nursing CEs for this webinar. And so after the call, I will send out information about how to access the CEs. If you do want to receive CEs, you have to fill out a post-test and an evaluation. But without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce Kelsey. Kelsey is a kidney transplant nurse practitioner and advanced practice provider manager at the University of New Mexico Hospital. She is also a DNP student whose scholarly work focuses on the environmental determinants of chronic kidney disease through planetary health and environmental health literacy lens. Her work centers on translating emerging evidence on heat exposure, air and water pollution, and novel chemical exposures, including microplastics, into practical, prevention-focused clinical tools for nurses and nurse practitioners. Kelsey is passionate about advancing environmental health equity, climate-informed kidney care, and empowering nurses to integrate planetary health principles into everyday practice. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Kelsey.
Well, hello, everyone. Like Kara said, my name is Kelsey. I am a family nurse practitioner in kidney transplant surgery, and I am a doctor of nursing practice student at the University of New Mexico. And as she said, for my DNP project, I'm excited to talk with you all today about the environmental factors and how they can affect kidney disease and what we as nurses and nurse practitioners can do in our everyday practice to help reduce these risks and ultimately decrease the burden of kidney disease. I'm really glad that you're here, and I appreciate you all taking the time to join me today. So to start, I wanted to share a bit of context. Some of you may already know this, but a DNP project gives students the opportunity to translate the best available evidence into real-world clinical practice. And when I was doing this, I really found that research shows that nurses and nurse practitioners often receive limited education in environmental health during their standard training. And because of this gap, my project really focuses on helping nurses and nurse practitioners identify local and individual environmental risk factors for kidney disease using an environmental health literacy framework. And I really chose this project because I've spent, the past 4 years with kidney transplant patients, and I've really seen firsthand the profound impact on their lives having chronic kidney disease. And so my goal is really just to strengthen the environmental health literacy in clinical care and help reduce the incidence of kidney disease. So for today's presentation, I will start with some brief background on kidney disease, what we currently know, and a few key statistics to start. From there, we will look at extreme environmental events from kidney disease with, a focus on extreme heat, acute kidney injury, and a brief discussion of chronic kidney disease of unknown etiology. Next, we will move into some key environmental exposures that affect kidney health, including ambient air pollution, water pollutants, and novel chemical exposures, and microplastics. We will then talk about some practical ways to mitigate these environmental determinants and discuss some prevention strategies that we can all incorporate into our everyday clinical practice. I will introduce a climate-related screening tool for patients, along with a companion tool for nurses and nurse practitioners. And then we will briefly review some documentation support to help make this visible into your medical records. We'll close by discussing some advocacy and policy opportunities. And my hope is that by the end of this session, you'll have a clearer understanding of environmental risk factors for kidney disease and feel confident identifying these risks and integrating them into your clinical practice. With that, let's get started. I'm sure most of us have seen this image or one similar to it. This image is from the Planetary Health Alliance, and it really reminds us that health doesn't exist in isolation. We often talk about the social determinants of health, like income, education, and access to care. But upstream of those are the ecological determinants, the large-scale changes that humans are making to Earth systems. Climate change, air, water, and soil pollution, resource scarcity, including fresh water, biodiversity loss, and land use changes. And these forces really reshape patterns of all disease. And in the center of the image is the heart labeled health impacts. This has non-communicable diseases, infectious diseases, direct injuries, and mental health effects. And kidney disease is also in that heart, even though it's not explicitly named. The kidney is, as you know, a very highly vascular, filtration-dependent organ. Blood circulates through the kidney many times a day. In one single day, the kidney can filter up to 150 quarts of blood. That itself makes it uniquely vulnerable to what is circulating in the bloodstream, the inflammatory mediators, particulate matter, heavy metals, and heat-related hypoperfusion. So when we see rising AKIs, faster chronic kidney disease progression, or unexplained renal decline, we should ask ourselves what ecological drivers could be shaping this physiology. To give a sense of the scope of the problem, the CDC estimates that nearly 36 million adults in the United States, about 14% of the population, is living with chronic kidney disease. What's especially concerning is that chronic kidney disease often goes undiagnosed until the later stages. In fact, about 90% of people with chronic kidney disease are unaware that they even, excuse me, are unaware that they even have the condition. While diabetes and hypertension remain the most common causes, we're now increasingly learning that environmental factors also play a role in the development and progression of kidney disease. Again, I won't go through all of these again, but these are the major environmental determinants that we will explore today. Before we get too deep into the presentation, I want to briefly review some of the pathophysiology that you'll hear referenced throughout the next slides. I'm sure it's been a few years since all of us went through pathophysiology. So when we talk about oxidative stress in kidney tissue, we are referring to an imbalance between the harmful reactive oxygen species, or the ROS, and the body's ability to really neutralize them. The kidney is highly metabolically active, particularly in the proximal tubule. So when oxidative stress overwhelms the protective mechanisms, that's when it damages the cell membranes, the proteins, and the mitochondrial function. Over time, repeated oxidative injury contributes to inflammation and fibrosis. When we look at heat stress and dehydration, renal blood flow decreases, which means there's less oxygen delivery to those tubular cells. And those cells rely heavily on ATP to maintain all the electrolyte gradients and the filtration process. So when ATP levels drop, the tubular cells lose the energy-dependent function. So if this is severe, or it's repeated over time, this results in the acute tubular injury. And even when a patient's creatinine recovers, the repeated episodes can accelerate CKD progression. And lastly, when we look at fine particulate matter, particularly PM 2.5, which we'll talk about more in a few slides, enters the circulation through the lungs primarily. It then triggers systemic inflammation and that oxidative stress, which leads to damaging the vascular endothelium. In the kidney, this leads to impaired microvascular perfusion and vascular injury. And over time, even the patients that have otherwise controlled chronic disease may experience cumulative microvascular damage from these environmental exposures. Chronic kidney disease of unknown etiology is a newer term that's out there. It's abbreviated CKDU. It refers to kidney disease that develops in the absence of traditional risk factors such as diabetes and hypertension, and has been strongly linked to environmental exposures. It's known to disproportionately affect certain populations, particularly workers exposed to extreme heat, dehydration, and environmental toxins. And it really highlights the important role that environmental and occupational exposures can play in kidney health. And it really reinforces the need to recognize these risks within our routine clinical care. One example of how the environment influences kidney physiology that we really have a lot of studies on is extreme heat exposures. The problem is that studying heat waves comes with several challenges. Although they're generally described as a prolonged period of extreme heat, there's no single universally accepted definition. Studies vary in the temperature thresholds they use, the metrics used, such as maximum or average daily temperature, and the duration of exposure considered. What we do know is that rising temperatures are associated with increased risk of heat-related illness and mortality, including kidney disease. An acute kidney injury, or an AKI, previously referred to as acute renal failure, is defined as a rapid decline in kidney excretory function, leading to the accumulation of metabolic waste and physiologic imbalance. And when we look at elevated ambient temperatures, particularly during these extreme heat events, they've been identified as a significant risk factor for AKIs. Although the exact timing varies, the impact of heat on AKI appears to occur very soon after the exposure, highlighting how acute and immediate this risk can be to our patients. The highest incidence of heat-related acute kidney injury is seen in the older adults, particularly males aged 64 and older, and in those individuals with chronic conditions such as diabetes, hypertension, heart failure, or pre-existing chronic kidney disease. Again, extreme heat exposure is one of the most well-studied environmental factors contributing to both the development and progression of chronic kidney disease. As we discussed earlier, chronic kidney disease of unknown etiology, or CKDU, occurs in the absence of traditional risk factors and is really thought to represent a tubulointerstitial process related to repeated heat stress events. While CKDU may look clinically similar to other forms of CKD, the repeated, often subtle, heat-related kidney injuries over time, or even one single severe episode, can lead to the same long-term consequences. So this makes a thorough and occupational and environmental history especially important. Heat exposure is most strongly associated with individuals performing physically demanding work in hot environments, and studies show that up to 15% of people, which is not insignificant, the people that are routinely exposed to occupational heat stress experience an AKI or chronic kidney disease during their lifetime. Mechanistically, the heat stress leads to that ATP depletion, which promotes inflammation and oxidative stress and ultimately contributes to the kidney injury. These effects are then further worsened by higher core body temperature, dehydration, and intense physical activity. From a clinical documentation perspective, it's important to recognize that there's currently no specific ICD-10 billing code for CKDU. However, if this is something suspected in an occupational or environmental context, careful documentation becomes especially important. As we all know, thorough documentation really supports both clinical clarity and appropriate reimbursement. This includes documenting potential environmental or occupational exposures, and then clearly noting the absence of the traditional causes such as diabetes or hypertension, and then using supporting Z codes for environmental or occupational exposures when appropriate. I will go through some specific ICD-10 and Z code examples later in the presentation. So particulate matter, specifically PM 2.5, often referred to as particle pollution, is made up of microscopic solid particles and liquid droplets suspended in the air. These particles are primarily produced through the combustion of fossil fuels and biomass. At a global level, the statistic always blows my mind. More than 99% of the world's population lives in areas where air quality exceeds the guideline limits set by the World Health Organization. And in addition to the particulate matter, other common gaseous air pollutants include nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, ozone, and volatile organic compounds. These pollutants are also largely produced by the burning of fossil fuels, such as gas, coal, and oil. Elevated concentrations are frequently found near construction sites, power plants, unpaved roads, agricultural fields, industrial smokestacks, and during combustion-related events like wildfires. Chronic exposure to PM 2.5 is very well established contributor to cardiovascular and respiratory disease, and has been associated with increased mortality in all cause. More recently, they have expanded beyond the lungs and the heart. Research now shows exposures to PM 2.5 have been linked to adverse reproductive outcomes, certain cancers, and importantly for this discussion, chronic kidney disease. In recognition of these risks, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency regulates PM 2.5 as one of 6 principal pollutants under the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. However, exposure levels still vary significantly by geography, season, and wildfire activity. So while regulation technically exists, exposure continues to remain widespread and for most patients completely unavoidable. This is again where kidney-specific implications become especially important. These air pollutants can have significant effects on kidney health, and their impact appears to be amplified again during extreme heat events. Mechanistically, fine particulate matter can enter the systemic circulation after inhalation. Once in the bloodstream, it promotes that oxidative stress, systemic inflammation, endothelial dysfunction, and vascular injury. At the cellular level, the damage includes DNA fragmentation, protein modification, and lipid peroxidation, all of which contribute to kidney cell dysfunction. And importantly, these are all the same physiologic pathways that drive CKD progression. Air pollution exposure can also worsen traditional CKD risk factors, such as diabetes and hypertension, further accelerating that disease progression. And then on top of that, when PM 2.5 particles are bound to heavy metals, the resulting oxidative stress and sustained inflammatory response may intensify the renal injury. So this clinically reinforces the importance of asking patients about the air quality exposure and heat stress and incorporating exposure reduction counseling into routine care. Water contamination also remains a significant and often under-recognized contributor to kidney injury. Another statistic that always really surprises me is that the World Health Organization estimates that more than 200 million people globally are chronically exposed to arsenic in their drinking water above recommended guideline levels. And another recent estimate suggests that approximately 73 million people in the United States alone have drinking water contaminated with PFAS, or sometimes referred to as forever chemicals. Those two statistics alone really highlight how widespread environmental nephrotoxic exposures can be. Heavy metals such as arsenic, cadmium, lead, and uranium are all very well-established nephrotoxins. These compounds preferentially accumulate in the proximal tubules, where they generate oxidative stress, disrupt mitochondrial function, and activate those inflammatory pathways. Over time, that leads to the tubular injury and progressive chronic kidney disease. Mercury exposure, often through contaminated seafood, represents another pathway. And importantly, not all contamination is industrial. In many regions, including parts of the southwestern United States, naturally occurring groundwater contamination with arsenic and uranium really complicates water safety. Patients may be exposed for decades without realizing it. And for us as nurses and nurse practitioners, this means asking about water source. Do you use a private well versus municipal supply? Do you have a rural residence? And any other occupational exposures should become part of the kidney risk assessment. The kidney is our filtration organ after all. This table looks really dense, and that's okay. It's really meant more to show the scope and not to be memorized. The key point is that multiple common environmental exposures have documented renal effects. We know that lead, cadmium, and arsenic are not rare toxins. They're found in aging infrastructure, tobacco smoke, groundwater, and industrial runoff. Mercury occurs through seafood from contaminated water source, as well as from coal combustion, waste incineration, and some consumer products. PFAS, or the forever chemicals, have been found in food packaging, nonstick cookware, and contaminated drinking water. And again, uranium and other contaminants occur in groundwater, particularly in the Southwest United States, former mining sites, and even some food sources. What matters clinically is the pattern. Across all of these exposures, we repeatedly see proteinuria, reduced eGFR, hypertension, nephrolithiasis, and progressive CKD. So again, when we have a patient and we just see that the kidney disease is progressing in ways that don't really fit the traditional risk factors, it's reasonable to ask the questions, where's the patient's water coming from? Again, private well use and any other potential occupational or environmental exposures that we should consider. Microplastics and nanoplastics are small synthetic polymer particles. Microplastics are defined as those particles that are smaller than 5 millimeters, while nanoplastics are even smaller, less than 1 micrometer. These particles originate either from the breakdown of larger plastic materials or from plastics intentionally manufactured at microscopic sizes. Microplastics are now ubiquitous environmental contaminants. They have been detected in air, water, food, and soil, and increasingly they're also being detected in human tissues and biological fluids, including blood, urine, kidneys, placenta, lungs, liver, intestines, brains, and reproductive organs. Human exposure occurs primarily through ingestion, inhalation of airborne fibers and dust, and dermal contact with textiles and consumer products. For clinicians, this really raises the important questions about chronic low-dose exposures and those potential implications for long-term kidney health. Once plastics enter the environment, they degrade very slowly over time through physical and chemical weathering processes such as photooxidation and thermooxidation. Over time, this leads to fragmentation into what we call secondary microplastics. In contrast, the primary microplastics are intentionally manufactured at microscopic sizes for use in consumer and industrial products. Because plastics are so widespread in both the ecosystem and everyday products, exposure to microplastics now is essentially unavoidable. And emerging research really raises concern that microplastics can accumulate within kidney tissue and impair renal function. Human data is still limited, but animal studies consistently show structural and functional kidney changes after exposure to microplastics. It is hypothesized that the microplastics reach the kidney through the systemic circulation, enter the renal microcirculation, and interact with the proximal tubular epithelial cells before eventually being eliminated in the urine. And clinically, this also really highlights the kidney's dual role as a target of exposure and a pathway for elimination. Despite the high global burden of chronic kidney disease, public awareness remains remarkably low. Worldwide, it's estimated that only about 6% of individuals living with CKD are aware that they have the condition. When this lack of awareness is combined with the growing health impacts of climate change, such as rising temperatures and increasing environmental exposures, it really creates a significant and expanding challenge for kidney health. But nurses and nurse practitioners are uniquely positioned to respond to these risks. With our strong focus on prevention, patient education, and longitudinal care, we are well suited to integrate this into our routine practice. By doing so, we can support earlier detection of kidney disease, guide clinical management, and implement these practical prevention-focused interventions. In many ways, everyday clinical encounters become powerful opportunities for prevention. This slide highlights the environmental screening tool that I developed for this project. It's intentionally brief and patient-friendly, so it can be completed within routine intake paperwork without adding burden to the visit. The questions are organized into key exposure categories: heat and hydration, air quality, water and chemical exposures, plastics, and underlying health conditions. This allows clinicians quickly to identify the environmental or climate-related risks that may be relevant to your patient's kidney health. A yes response doesn't automatically require intervention, but it really opens the door for focused counseling, education, and further assessment when appropriate. And the goal of this tool is to make environmental risk visible and actionable in our everyday practice. The second tool is designed specifically for us as nurses and nurse practitioners to support that clinical decision-making and patient education after the screening tool is completed. And the purpose is to really help translate that patient's yes response into those practical, evidence-informed actions that can be incorporated in their everyday practice. It provides guidance on follow-up questions, patient education points, and simple exposure reduction strategies that are appropriate across all care settings, from primary care to specialty practice. And again, importantly, this tool is not meant to add burden or create new workflows. Instead, it really is to support conversations that we're already having with our patients while making the environmental and climate-related kidney risks more visible and actionable. My hope is that these tools empower you to confidently address the environmental risks and make those meaningful impacts in your everyday clinical practice. And this slide really builds on that screening tool and moves us into those practical evidence-informed actions that we can take when these environmental risks are identified. For patients with occupational heat stress, we can counsel on structured hydration, rest breaks, cooling strategies, and educating to limit those dehydrating beverages. These simple interventions help prevent recurrent subclinical kidney injuries. For those exposed to poor air quality, we can recommend things like checking the local air quality indexes, limiting outdoor activity on high pollution days, using indoor filtration systems, and wearing appropriate respiratory protection when needed. When toxic chemicals or heavy metals are a concern, we can discuss things like certified water filtration, private well testing, reducing PFAS containing cookware, and safer food storage practices. And lastly, for microplastic exposures, some practical steps include choosing filtered tap water over bottled water, limiting single-use plastics, avoiding microwaving food in plastic containers, and being mindful of seafood and packaged food intake. Importantly, these recommendations are not about perfection. They are about harm reduction and targeted counseling, particularly for high-risk populations such as those with CKD, cardiovascular disease, occupational exposures, and pregnancy. And the key takeaway is that environmental risk mitigation can be integrated into all of our routine patient education, and there are realistic, simple, prevention-focused strategies that help support kidney health while advancing broader public health goals. This slide is meant to provide some quick documentation support. So as I discussed earlier, there's no single ICD-10 code for climate-related kidney disease or CKDU at this time, but the key takeaway is simple. If we use one exposure-related Z code paired with a kidney diagnosis or symptom code to document these environmental risks to support our counseling, labs, and follow-up. On the left side, you'll see the common environmental exposures, such as heat stress and dehydration, air pollution or wildfire smoke, unsafe drinking water, heavy metals, those chemicals like PFAS or solvents, and emerging concerns such as microplastics. Each of these has a corresponding exposure Z code that can be used in your documentation. And on the right side are examples of kidney-related diagnoses and symptom codes that can be paired with those exposure codes. Those include chronic kidney disease, acute kidney injury, dehydration, proteinuria, kidney stones, or other abnormal lab findings. And again, the goal is not perfect coding, but it's really just visibility, because documentation is one of the most powerful advocacy tools that we have as clinicians. And this approach really helps make the environmental risk factors part of the medical record and supports that appropriate counseling, diagnostic evaluation, and follow-up. And even documenting suspected exposures can be meaningful, especially in those patients with unexplained kidney disease or progressive CKD, despite good control of their traditional risk factors. So now we're going to move into a couple cases. So case number 1 is a 48-year-old male. He's a landscaping supervisor. He has no diabetes, no hypertension. You notice that his creatinine has gone from 1.0 to 1.4 over the past 2 years. He has mild proteinuria today on his urinalysis in clinic, and he tells you that he just feels wiped out every summer. And of note, he tells you he drinks sports drinks and coffee. So again, this patient doesn't really fit our classic CKD picture. He has no diabetes, no hypertension, his BMI is reasonable, his blood pressure is normal, but his creatinine really has just been slowly increasing over the last 2 summers. He again tells you that he just is exhausted in the heat, but he pushes through because that's the job. And he's limiting bathroom breaks because it slows down the crew. And he again is drinking these sports drinks and coffee. So in a patient with this story, here is what I would think about. Some additional questions that we could ask him would be, how many hours a day are you outdoors? Do you have access to shade or cooling? How often are you feeling dehydration symptoms such as dizziness or decreased urinary output? Do you use NSAIDs during the summer? And do you notice any changes in your urine output during work days? And like we discussed, mechanistically, heat is leading to renal hypoperfusion, which leads to tubular ATP depletion, to oxidative stress, and these repeated minor injuries lead to chronic kidney disease progression. And this kind of patient is somebody that is very consistent in a pattern of CKDU population. So this is most likely recurrent subclinical AKIs from heat stress and dehydration. And in a patient like this, we could document Z5 7.9 as the occupational exposure, paired with E8 6.0, the dehydration, and R8 0.9 as proteinuria. Next, we have case number 2. This is a 67-year-old female. She has pre-existing CKD stage 3A. Her A1C is 6.7. Her blood pressure is 124/70. She denies the use of NSAIDs, yet her EGFR continues to decline. And in her social history, you find out that she lives near the interstate. So this patient is perfectly managed on paper. Her diabetes is controlled, her blood pressure is controlled, her medications are optimized, and she again denies use of additional NSAIDs, yet her kidney function is declining faster than we would expect. She does live near that major highway. She tells you that her windows are open much of the year, and she just loves to walk outdoors every day. So we could ask ourselves, could this be a chronic exposure to particulate matter and air pollution? So we know that her traditional risk factors are optimized. Other possible contributors could include PM 2.5 exposure, heavy metal copollutants, and as we discussed earlier, PM 2.5 triggers that oxidative stress, systemic inflammation, endothelial dysfunction, and it can worsen diabetes and hypertension physiology, even when they appear controlled. And if we ignore these environmental drivers, we risk labeling patients as non-compliant when physiology is being shaped upstream and it's completely out of their control. We could educate this patient to check local AQI or air quality index during wildfire season, recommend limiting time outdoors on those high AQI days, consider a HEPA filtration indoors, and really reinforce hydration during high heat, poor air quality days. And lastly, we have patient number 3. Patient number 3 is a 35-year-old fitness instructor, has no chronic conditions, has recurrent small renal calculi, has a borderline creatinine, and tells you that she drinks bottled water daily and she heats all of her food in plastics. So this patient considers herself extremely health conscious. She hydrates constantly, she's eating clean, she exercises every day. But again, she's relying heavily on bottled water, heats her food in plastic containers, and uses protein supplements stored in plastic tubs. She's having those micro stones with the borderline creatinine with no traditional risk factors. Some potential exposures that could be overlooked would be the microplastics in the bottled water, leaching from heated plastics, chemical additives such as BPA alternatives, and the supplement container contamination. We could counsel a patient like this, try not to scare them, but education things could be using glass or stainless steel water bottles, avoid heating food in plastic, choose filtered tap water when safe, and try to, again, frame it more as a risk reduction rather than a fear. And these cases really highlight something important, that many environmental drivers of kidney disease are invisible in clinic, but these exposures don't happen in isolation. I want to briefly connect today's discussion to current environmental and regulatory developments. As we all know, recent EPA decisions have revoked the endangerment finding that previously recognized greenhouse gases as a public health threat, altering the regulatory framework for air pollution. At the same time, updates to mercury and air toxic standards have been repealed, which could potentially increase emissions of mercury, arsenic, and other hazardous pollutants, substances that are well-established contributors to kidney dysfunction. Ongoing legal challenges reflect just how dynamic this policy landscape continues to be. Alongside these regulatory changes, the world is also experiencing record-breaking heat events, increasing the risk of these occupational acute kidney injuries and CKDU patterns. Policy decisions influence air quality, water safety, and workplace protections, the same exposures we just discussed as drivers of kidney disease. So in other words, the policy environment ultimately shapes the exposure environments our patients are living in, which raises an important question as what role can we as clinicians play in prevention? Advocacy doesn't mean stepping outside of our scope. It really means just extending prevention upstream. First, by protecting our workers, we've seen how recurrent heat stress can lead to tubular ATP depletion and repeated subclinical kidney injury. By supporting OSHA heat standards and ensuring access to hydration, shade, and rest helps prevent recurrent dehydration and hypoperfusion, and ultimately prevents chronic kidney injury. Second, by protecting our communities. Air and water exposures are often invisible to patients. Supporting things like PFAS drinking water limits, lead service line replacements, and access to filtration in wildfire-prone areas reduces chronic inflammatory and oxidative stress at the population level. These policies directly influence the environmental exposures entering renal circulation. And finally, leading within our own health systems. We don't have to wait for federal policy to act. We can embed environmental screening into our routine care, document exposures using Z codes, and integrate environmental risk into CKD management. Documentation makes risk visible, screening makes prevention actionable, and prevention is most powerful when it happens upstream. So in closing, as we've discussed today, kidney disease is not influenced by clinical factors alone. It's no longer shaped only by glucose and blood pressure. It's increasingly shaped by heat, air, water, chemicals, and the environments our patients cannot opt out of. Extreme heat contributes to recurrent subclinical kidney injury. Air pollution drives systemic inflammation and vascular dysfunction. Water contaminants and emerging chemicals introduce oxidative stress directly into renal circulation. And microplastics remind us that new exposures are continually emerging. These environmental inputs begin shaping renal physiology long before patients reach end-stage disease. The encouraging part is this. Nurses and nurse practitioners are uniquely positioned to respond. Through intentional screening, thoughtful documentation, targeted counseling, and upstream advocacy, we can make environmental risk visible and actionable in everyday practice. The tools I shared today are not meant to add burden. They're meant to strengthen the work you're already doing, helping you ask one more question, make one more connection, and prevent one more episode of avoidable kidney injury. Prevention is most powerful when it happens upstream because the environments our patients live in are not separate from the care we provide. My hope is that you leave today feeling more confident recognizing environmental risk factors for kidney disease and really empowered to integrate this lens into your own practice. Not perfectly, but consistently. Thank you to Annie for the opportunity to share this work. I truly appreciate your time, your engagement, and the work that you do every day to advance health in your communities. Before we wrap up, I have one quick request. As part of my DNP project, I'm collecting brief survey feedback related to this presentation. The survey is short, completely voluntary, and incredibly important to my DNP work. Your responses will help evaluate the impact of this education and guide future efforts to integrate environmental health into nursing and nurse practitioner education and practice. If you're willing, I'd really appreciate you taking a few minutes to complete this using the link or QR code provided. Thank you all.
Thank you, Kelsey. That was really great. My question for you, if I can start with questions,
Yeah, go
is
ahead.
are you planning on publishing this work and or just sharing this toolkit for providers for us to take and use?
So I do have an article published in the Journal of Nurse Practitioners that has a lot of this information, but the toolkits are not part of it, but I'm super happy to share any of the toolkits that I made for this presentation.
Fantastic. I will follow up with you then after this call and can share it with the individuals that are on the call too.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Kelsey. That was a great presentation. Quick question regarding
Yeah.
the ICD-10. I know ICD-10 is not really being used appropriately for this one, but you did mention we can use the Z codes. Are those codes billable?
Unfortunately, no, and that's why at this point I feel it's more just visibility rather than reimbursement, which is unfortunate, but I'm hopeful that if we all continue to start using them, somebody will recognize them and hopefully make them billable.
Yeah, because we are bringing this topic to our MedX committee next month. Because we do see a lot of patients. We are in Miami, so we do
Oh
see a
yeah.
lot of patients coming in with heat-related
Yeah.
kidney issues. So we're really trying to, incorporate this into our ICDs.
Yeah. I'm hopeful that they'll eventually jump on the wagon and recognize that it's real and that we really need things like that in our documentation.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. A lot of the microplastic work also gets done here at UNM. I've had a good time actually shadowing one of the microplastics lab members, and we're doing work with kidney stones and urine here at UNM. So it's been really interesting diving into the microplastics world of all of this as well. It's quite scary.
Yeah. And there was some study saying that each one of us have like 1 teaspoon of microplastic in us, or it's
I feel like we're a little bit past that, but
yeah,
I wish it was only a teaspoon.
it's a lot.
Yeah.
I've heard that it's like a credit card, the amount that we have of microplastics that we have in our
Yeah.
bodies on average.
And I recently presented at one of the microplastics conferences here, and they were saying that really it's not our generation that can do anything about it, but if we in our generation share, it's for the people, 40, 50 years down the road that we're really trying to spare from this microplastic exposure. So
Any other questions for Kelsey? Feel free to just unmute or pop a question in the chat if you're not in a place to speak.
Kara, are you going to mention about the CE credits? How we can get them?
Yes. Yeah. So after I have to send everything over to Hannah for her to fill out the information and post it to the learning site, the recording to the learning site. And then once that's up, I will be able to share with you how to get your nursing CEs.
Thanks, Kara.
Of course. I guess I have one question
Yeah.
before we wrap. So I was doing a little bit, I was working on a section on environmental or occupational exposures relating to environmental health, and I just went a little bit into the chronic kidney disease of like unknown etiology. And is there any more movement into actually like being able to have a strong determination of like heat in labor being a risk factor, or is it still kind of uh I guess it's not causal, but is there a stronger association that's being shown by research or no?
I think yes, but again, it's hard without, like tissue diagnosis of saying you had nothing else going on. Because in my world, it's like, what did your chronic kidney disease come from? And we have actual diagnosis. I think the hard part is that because people don't realize that heat stress and being outside can cause this, that we're still early in many people knowing that and actually putting that in places, if that makes sense.
No, that does that. I wasn't thinking about like the having to really rule out all other potential causes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because even patients that are like, oh, I've never had high blood pressure, their kidney biopsies definitely showed that it was like a hypertensive cause to their renal disease. And so I think we're still early. I'm hopeful that one day it'll be very obvious that for these poor people that are outside just working all the time and coming in with these heat-related injuries that we can really correlate that. And I'm sure that really makes patients feel better as well as having a reason. Because if you just end up with this horrible disease and there's no real cause, you just, it's like, oh, well, here's the reason why. And I think that would really make patients feel a lot better at the end of the day as well if we could give them a reason why.
Thank you. Any other questions? I'll just pause for a few seconds to see if anybody has anything. All right. Well, please join me in showing some love for Kelsey's presentation. It was fantastic. Very well done. And I think the toolkits are incredibly impactful. If you have, again, share the links with us and we can get those added to, if you want us to add them
Yeah.
to the learning site, but if not, we can get them sent out to those who registered for the webinar so they can follow up with the
I'll
information.
definitely get this sent over. Happy to share.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
And just for folks, so you know what's happening coming up with the practice forum, we have a really exciting two-part series coming up in April and I believe May, but Kylie, correct me if I'm wrong. And Kylie, I wonder if you are in a place where you can share just a really brief overview of what we're going to have.
Yes. So we are partnering with Bluebird Cultural Initiative, which is here local in the Midwest area. They're in Omaha, Council Bluffs area. They are a tribal nonprofit that was actually established during the Standing Rock in South Dakota with the pipeline. And while they were there for 2 years, they established themselves as a tribal education nonprofit to help teach their youth Lakota language and customs, their tribal music, And after that, they've continued as a nonprofit. They do a lot of work here educating youth and families on the Lakota tribal ways. They also do a lot of advocacy, especially around the environment. So we are going to have their executive director, Nicole, who will be co-presenting with us, really speaking. She'll do 2 seminars, one in our April and one in May. And the first one we're kind of looking at will just be a history of their establishment and how we all can partner with tribal groups across the nation to assist in environmental advocacy and health related initiatives. We do work with them closely, and so we'll share a couple of our initiatives as a nursing college, how we've got our students involved and our nurses in the area. So I'm really looking forward. It'll be a storytelling type session where Nicole will share their story, and then we'll have time for all of us to engage in thought sharing and hopefully idea development of how we can all partner locally with our groups.
Thanks, Kylie. I've seen a little bit of the outline that Kylie's working on with Nicole, and it looks really fantastic. I'm super excited for it. I popped in the registration link, so the calls are April 21st and May 19th at the same time, so 3 p.m. Eastern. And we hope that you can join us. With that, we'll go ahead and close our call, and thank you everyone for joining. Have a good